everyone.
Hola, muy buenas tardes a todas.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Les damos la más cordial bienvenida
A warm welcome to the webinar titled Identities and Literature for Children, Body, Gender, and Nation. We're pleased to have you here with us today, and we're very excited to discuss with you about the phenomena and topics we're presenting today. I am Isabel Ibaceta, Assistant Professor at the Institute of Educational Science at Universidad de O'Higgins. I have a BA in Information Science, a Master's in Children's Literature from the University of Roehampton, and PhD in Literature from Universidad. I'm co-editor of the book Literature from published from a journal in 2016. I'm currently directing the Fonda Citizenization project entitled Landscape and Geography in Children's Narrative in Chile. Cultural Constructions of National Regional Identity. Founded by the research grant of International Research Society for Children's Literature, IRSCL, and by the National Agency for Research and Development of Chile, ANID. I'm also participating in a project entitled National and Cultural Identity in Narrations of Traditional Indigenous Stories in Children's Literature, led by Dr. Jimena Troncoso of the Universidad Católica del Maule. And I direct the project within which this webinar is framed. I will share a brief presentation with you. To give you context about the project within this webinar stream. This webinar corresponds to a cultural activity for a project entitled Issues on National and Regional Identities in Literature for Children and Adolescents. Interdisciplinary academic exchanges. This project was founded by Fund for the Development of International Networking for Regional Institutions as a part of a National Center for Research and Development. There is vast evidence regarding the relevance that literature written for children and adolescents has in the shaping, transmission, validation of or subversion of national and regional identity. The children's literature have rendered the complex relationships between these literary discourses and phenomena such as globalization, colonialism, miscegenation, imperialism, modernization processes, environmental crisis, the sense of territorial belonging, the constitution of national language, the concept of race, citizenship, and interculturalism, and the resulting influence on social cohesion of the nations. Considering the critical place that this type of discourses hold in our past and present as societies, we believe that this project constitutes a contribution to the investigation of these discourses. Consequently, to what I just said, the aim of this project was to articulate an international multidisciplinary academic network about national and regional identities. This network was articulated along with Universidad de Higgins, Universidad Católica del Maule, Universidad Autónoma de Chile, la Universidad de Concepción, all of them located in different regions from Chile, as well as the Pennsylvania State University and the University of Oklahoma. The reason behind this collaboration, aside from the interest of the scholars on the relative topic about the identity, are the common challenges faced by the three Chilean regions, O'Higgins, Maule, and Temuco, in the case of the Universidad Autónoma. These common challenges between these universities and the universities from the United States. All of them are regional entities inside communities whose sociocultural context evidence important levels of rurality. For example, population declared indigenous or migrant. There are also common historical political elements between the region of O'Higgins and Pennsylvania regarding the territories intimately linked to the American independence processes, both in Chile and the United States. I would like to show all of the participants from this project. As you can see here in my screen, our colleagues from Universidad Católica del Maule, Universidad Católica de Chile, Oklahoma as well, Pennsylvania State University, Universidad de Concepción, y Universidad de Higgins. Also, I would like to thank all of you, our colleagues, be interested in this project, for participating in all the work you've done. It makes me very happy to be here giving a closure for this project along with you. In this network that we established was held using a framework of multilateral online working sessions for about a year. During this period, a work methodology was developed in different stages. Among them, we discussed theory around identity issues authored by academics associated with the project. We assessed current critical theory related to the project, and we designed some instances of training between the universities related to the project. And currently, and as a consequence, we are working on 2 articles that we're going to share today before our keynote speech. And before we do that, I would like to highlight some of the results of the project. First of all, the organization of the virtual symposium, Childhood and Children's Literature in Chile, Traditions and Innovations. was organized by our colleague Maria Trujillo and Emily Sir from the Department of Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese of Pennsylvania State University last December. Additionally, thank our colleague Jimena Troncoso for the lecture that we held with some students and other scholars from the Universidad Católica in November of 2020. As I pointed out earlier, we want to share some of the articles we're working on. They have there are two researches where we participated. Since they're under development, as I mentioned, it's important for us to have feedback in this stage and to be able to discuss with you. So I invite you to make notes, your suggestions, doubts, ideas, or any other comment you may have. Once we finish our lectures, we will have space for questions and answers. We're going to start with our first research that is called, at the moment, Foundational Children's Fictions, Nation, Gender, and Body. And it's going to be presented by our colleague, Emily Sturck. Dr. Emily is visiting assistant professor of Spanish and Consortium for Faculty Diversity Fellow at Haverford College. She earned her PhD from the Pennsylvania State University. Emily's dissertation critically examines literary and cultural representations of cross-cultural encounters between international tourists and sex workers in the American tropics. The keywords that organize her publications and courses are anti-colonialism, feminism, girlhood, translation, speculative fiction, sex, and sexuality. Her work has appeared in Translation Review, Cincinnati, Romance Review, and Voces del Caribe. Emily teaches a range of interdisciplinary courses in Spanish and comparative literature, including Latin American feminist science fiction, Hispanic career migration tales, and introduction to Spanish literature. She also served as a general education development and as an English as a second language instructor within the correction education program at the St. County Correctional Facility in Belmont, Pennsylvania. Now I will leave you with Emily.
Okay. Thank you, Isabel, for the introduction and for all of your contributions on this project, and most importantly, for your leadership over the past few years. Thanks must also go to Penn State's Department of Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. And finally, thank you to all those in attendance this afternoon for taking the time to support our project. I will now be offering a brief summary of our working article, Foundational Children's Fiction, Nation, Gender, and Body. This proposed article is derived from our working group's interrogation of the intersections between nation, gender, and racialized embodiment. Across the Americas, there is countless children's literature that depicts romantic relationships between colonized peoples and colonizers, the Disney myth of Pocahontas and John Smith perhaps being the most popular. This popular trope in children's literature led us to Doris Sommer's generative work, Foundational Fictions, the National Romances of Latin America. In her 1991 book, Sommer maintains that erotic rhetoric abounds in canonical national novels like José de Alencar's Iracema from Brazil and Jorge Isaac's Maria from Colombia. According to Sommer, these novels are oftentimes required reading in secondary schools, and the original text is reinterpreted through plays, films, and television series, thereby solidifying the narrative's historic role in national identity formations. In the 19th century, foundational texts played a pivotal part in legitimating newly independent Latin American nations, while also ensuring their prosperous futures. Sommer notes how novels became a vehicle for Creole authors to grapple with their connections, or rather disconnections, to the Americas, asserting, quote, "Without a proper genealogy to root them in the land, the Creoles had at least to establish conjugal and then paternity rights, making a generative rather than a geological claim. They had to win America's heart and body so that the fathers could found her and reproduce themselves as cultivated men. To be legitimate, their love had to be mutual. Even if the fathers set the tone, the mothers had to reciprocate," end of quote. In her reading of foundational fictions, Sommer turns to the feminization of the Americas and an erotics of politics found within characters' heterosexual romances across racial or regional lines in order to legitimize their emerging nations. Therefore, building upon Sommer's argument that sex and nation are inseparable, as well as incorporating the theoretical framework of imagology, this article offers a reading of a children's literature corpus of foundational fictions that document cross-cultural encounters between indigenous peoples and colonial settlers. The text featured in this study include Alonso en la Guira de Arauco, published in Chile in 2007, Ana Cayona, Golden Flower, published in the United States in 2005, and various reproductions of the Pocahontas myth. Here, we are in dialogue with both Sommer's theoretical proposals regarding the didactic elements of national literature and diverse immunological tenets and tools, which not only allow us to critically analyze our specific corpus, but to prove the usefulness of the NIAT and the applications of imagological principles to the study of children's literature in both Chile and the United States. Our study opens with our colleague, Dr. Maria Trulio, who traces the uses of Pocahontas in children's literature in the US, synthesizing an already significant body of scholarship devoted to the expansive corpus of Pocahontas books for children and young adults. In doing so, Maria underscores how this foundational fiction based on colonized indigenous women has generated an auto-image by means of a hetero-image. Towards the end of her study, Maria explores recent YA books written by indigenous authors who offer a counter-narrative to the Pocahontas mytho-history in order to point to the ways in which national auto-image constructions becomes a field of contestation. For instance, Indigenous author Cynthia Leitich Smith critiques the dominant narrative of Pocahontas as the American princess throughout her 2001 book, Rain Is Not My Indian Name, where her protagonist contrasts her lived experiences as an Indigenous girl with the fantasies propagated by the Pocahontas story. Similarly, Abenaki author Joseph Bruchak's 2003 Pocahontas challenges the whiteness ideologies that have fueled the Pocahontas mytho-history. Maria interrogates the ways in which these stories bring critics to question the true and authentic versions of Pocahontas, thereby underscoring the ways in which the dynamics of their own voices movement has influenced reception of these more recent children's and YA books. Dr. Isabel Ibaceta then moves us into a study of Alonso in la Guerra de Arauco, published in 2007, a historical novel that tells the story of Alonso, the son of a Spanish couple born in Chile in the second half of the 16th century. Alonso's friend, Peleo, is kidnapped by Mapuche peoples, and Alonso must therefore team up with the Mapuche boy, Wenchulaf, in order to rescue his friend, excuse me. Throughout Alonso in La Guerra de Arauco, there are constant allusions to the positive synergic relationships among the colonized and the colonizer. For example, the book highlights the multicultural development of friendship between Alonso and Wenchulaf. As a result of this relationship, and only through the combined knowledge, abilities, and cultural backgrounds of Alonso and Wenchulaf, they are able to successfully rescue Peleo. The potentialities of a new mixed culture are symbolically expressed through the depiction of this successful union and successful rescue, along with Alonso's acceptance of his familial lineage. His aunt's marriage to a Mapuche man was not originally accepted by his family. Here, through the representation of the mixture of native and Spanish cultures, a distinctive new cultural group is called upon, that is, the Chilean nation. This consolidation and approval of interracial unions promotes the development of cross-cultural Latin American nations, as Summer demonstrates. That is, the configuration of the hetero images, Mapuche peoples, and the auto image, Spanish descendants, give birth to a new auto image, a Chilean one. Our study concludes with my analysis of Edwidge Danticat's Anacayona Golden Flower, which, as part of Scholastic's Royal Diaries series, offers a fictional narrative of the Taino cacica's life and leadership until her death by hanging at the hands of the colonial governor, Nicolas Ovando. Anacoyana's diary, as reconstructed by Danticat, documents her formative years from a cacica in training alongside her brother, to her marriage to a neighboring tribe chief, Canobo, to the birth of her daughter, Higmota, to the Taino enslavement and genocide at the hands of Christopher Columbus. Although the diary ends after a violent battle between the Taino and the Spanish colonizers, with frequent allusions to Anacayona's eventual hanging, Danticat refuses to reduce Anacayona's story to her final interactions with settler colonizers, with Anacayona insisting, quote, "I do not want it to become the only story we ever have to share with one another. It cannot be, it must not be," end of quote. In Danticat's fictionalization, Anacayona exists both before and after Spanish colonialism and is not merely defined by her relationship to the conquerors. A great deal of scholarship has been produced about the influence of Scholastic Press and their historical fiction book series, Dear America, Dear Canada, My Name is America, My America, and the aforementioned The Royal Diary series, The Royal Diaries, to name a few. For instance, Kim Wilson contends that written reimaginings of colonized and enslaved peoples like Anacayona romanticizes their resistance, implying that, quote, "rights and freedoms are easily won, making a mockery of those who suffered and endured, and by implication did not have the courage to take a stand," end of quote. While it is certainly critical for young adult authors to address systemic and structural racism and inequalities, Wilson's interrogation of the quote-unquote likelihood that Jasper Jonathan Pierce, a servant in 1620, and Elizabeth Harvey, a convict in 1790, would, quote, "vocalize criticisms of justice and equity," end of quote, diminishes the need for diverse children's literature and upholds the whitening of historical fiction. In response to Wilson's criticism, I turned to Danticat's Anacayona Golden Flower as an entry point to critically evaluate the role of the Royal Diaries series on Indigenous identity constructions. Despite the deluge of scholarship that considers scholastic historical fiction, to date, no work has explored the young adult book series through the framework of foundational fictions. Therefore, in her reading of Danticat's Anacayona, I critically analyze how Danticat highlights a sovereign indigenous identity for her young audience, resulting in the unlearning of Columbus's discovery of the Americas. By underscoring the ways in which Danticat constructs an indigenous auto-image of the Taino, I offer a new perspective on the foundational fiction and contend that Danticat's book emphasizes the importance of historical fiction as a supplementary pedagogical tool that challenges hegemonic historical narratives. In sum, this collaborative and interdisciplinary project critically examines the role of foundational fictions written for children and young adults in the formation of national identities. In future iterations of this project, we plan to incorporate the Chilean novel Quidura Joven Mapuche, published in 1992, into our discussions of foundational fictions across the Americas. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Emily,
Thank you, Emily,
por tu presentación,
for your
por
presentation,
hacer ese resumen tan completo de
to
este
summarize
trabajo que está
very
en
well
desarrollo.
this working process.
Y como les contaba, en una segunda línea de indagación, en un
As I
segundo
said,
artículo
in a second
en el que
research
estamos trabajando,
that we're working on,
va a ser presentado por nuestra colega, la
will be presented
doctora
by our
Jimena
colleague
Troncoso
Jimena
Arauz,
Troncoso
de
Arauz
la Universidad Católica del Maule.
from Universidad
La
Católica de
doctora
Maule.
Troncoso es profesora asociada del
Dr.
Departamento
Troncoso
de
is
Ciencias de la
Associate
Educación
Professor
de
in the
la
Education
Universidad
Science
Católica del
Department
Maule.
at Universidad
Sus
Católica del
intereses
Maule.
docentes
Her teaching
y de
and
investigación
research
incluyen la
interests
literatura infantil y
include
juvenil,
children's and youth
la
literature,
literatura latinoamericana, la educación
Latin
literaria
American
y
literature,
la promoción de la
literary education, and literacy promotion.
Se cayó la expositora. Se cayó la expositora. Vamos a hacer una pequeña pausa hasta que vuelva o si es que está acá.
Estoy aquí, ¿se escucha?
Sí, ahora sí volviste, gracias.
Perdón, puede ser a causa de del temporal que tenemos en Chile.
Could have been because of the rain we're having right now.
Presentando a la
I
doctora
was
Jimena Troncoso.
presenting Dr. Troncoso.
Ella es profesora asociada del Departamento de Ciencias de la
She is
Educación
associate professor in the Education Science
de la
Department
Universidad Católica del
at
Maule.
Universidad Católica del Maule.
Sus intereses docentes y de investigación
Her teaching
incluyen
and research
la
interests
literatura
include
infantil y juvenil, la
children's and
literatura
youth literature,
latinoamericana,
Latin American
la
literature,
educación literaria
literary
y la
education,
promoción de la alfabetización.
and
Es
literacy
la
promotion.
autora principal del libro
She is the main
titulado
author of the
Antología
book
Crítica
Antología
del
Crítica
Relato
del
Infantil
Relato Infantil
Sudamericano,
Sudamericano
publicado en 2015.
and has
Y ha escrito artículos en diferentes
and
revistas
has written articles
académicas,
in different
formadora de
academic journals.
maestros de educación
She trains
primaria
elementary
y se encuentra en
education
máster en
teachers and
didáctica de la
teaches
lengua y la
in the
literatura.
master's program in
Actualmente dirige
didactics
la
of language and
metodología y los
literature.
procesos de
She is
aprendizaje
currently
y
directing the
especialización
master's
en
program in
promoción
learning
de la
process
lectura
with
y
a
la escritura.
specialization in
Les
promotion of
dejo
reading
con
and
la
writing.
doctora Troncoso.
Now I will leave you with Dr. Troncoso.
Jimena, tienes que activar tu...
Activa el audio, Jimena. Active el audio, Jimena.
Oh, disculpen, ahí está activado el audio ya, ¿no? ¿Sí? ¿Estoy compartiendo?
It is working? Yes. Am I sharing my screen as well? Yes. Thank you.
Bien.
Okay.
De este trabajo
The
es
title of
Evolución y
this work is
Transformación
The
de
Body
Identidad
and its
Nacional
Transformation in the Configuration of a Sense of National and Cultural Identity.
En esta ponencia
During this
trabajamos
presentation,
María Trujillo, quien habla,
we were together with Maria Truglio and Isabel Ilaceta.
Bien.
Okay.
En las últimas 5 décadas,
The last 5 decades, the body, as a political symbolic construction, has become central to the critical discussion in the field of literary studies. This centrality has its origin in the development of social and historical phenomena in different spheres of public life and areas of knowledge, such as the expansion of capitalism, the development of a consumer culture, together with hygiene, medical care, and body intervention, as David Le Breton points out in his text Anthropology of the Body and Modernity. Additionally, we witnessed social and demographic phenomena such as the spread of feminist movements, the appearance of diseases such as AIDS, the aging of industrial societies, to quote Turner, and the experience of the Great War, events that also give rise to the development of a cult of the body, a disciplined, athletic, healthy, and powerful body that is positioned as a phenomenon of political reflection as never before, as Hernandez Medina and Truglio point out in their texts, Modernism and the Avant-Garde Body in Spain and Italy. Within the framework of this global material and biopolitical interest in the body, it is not coincidence that in the 1990s, the symbolic uses of the body were a topic of discussion that began to develop in the literature of childhood, as David Goherman reported. And during this line of research, you can see that there has been a great progress. Faced with a constant use and literary thematization of the body within the framework of the discussion of our international networking project, we set out to investigate the ways in which the textualized materiality of bodies and how it speaks to us of ideologies of nation, nationalism, and cultural belonging. The body-nation nationality relationship is rooted partially in the concrete dimension in which a body is generally born with territorial roots, as discussed by Timothy Burnham, which in turn is linked to the collective socio-discursive composition of its society. As Le Breton points out, if each human group generates a particular knowledge, meaning, and value around the body, Hence, the body is a fertile space to be read as it narrates the particularities that each culture configures as its own. As a result of collaborative work and using a fruitful dialogue that is complemented by different theoretical lines, such as the sociology of the body, gender studies, biopolitics, and imagology, we propose that through the history of literature for children, it is possible to trace the change of ideologies of body in the service of the nation, which moved from a notion of modern corporality back to the pre-modern vision. Western conceptions of the body inherit from modern rationalist, secular, and positivist principles have their highest point in individualism as a social structure. On the other hand, in pre-modern visions, as Le Breton explains, body and soul, mind or consciousness are not separated, but constitute a single entity whose matter is no different from those that make up natural space and the cosmos. As well, we shall see the most current literature is linked to the latter perspective as a response to the strong anthropocentrism in our era. Following this path, we are currently working on an article in which we propose
Cuatro textos
a
aparentemente
critical reading of national bodies for apparently different texts, territorial and chronologically, which nevertheless focus on the discourses around the nation, cultural and territorial belonging through the uses of the body. We refer to the novels Quota by Edmondo de Amicis, published in Italy, and Five Midnights from 2019 by Anne Davila Cardinal, published in USA, as well as the anthologies entitled Aventura y Orígenes de los Pájaros, lectura de mitos chilenos para niños, niñas y jóvenes, and Hazañas y grandezas de los animales chilenos, lecturas de mitos originarios para niños, niñas y jóvenes, de Sonia Montesinos, published in 2011 and 2012, respectively. In the first section of our article, we have the contribution of Dr. Maria Truglio about Edmondo de Amicis' Heart, published in 1886. This book, along with Carlo Collodi's The Adventures of Pinocchio, is one of the classics of the golden century of Italian children's literature, and one of the books that helped to forge a sense of Italianness in the years immediately after the political unification of Italy, completed in 1870. The novel takes place in 1883, the year of Giuseppe Garibaldi's death, and takes the form of a school diary. Young Enrico narrates the daily events of his touring classroom, where he and the 53 other boys learn from their kind but severe teacher, Mr. Berboni, to become boys with heart. Translated into English and Spanish shortly after its original publication, the book was, for many years, a regular part of the Italian and as well Latin American curriculum and remains well known in Italy, although it is still often, and rightly, described as sentimental, paternalistic, and even saccharine. Throughout the novel, the idea of having heart repeats itself as a dominant symbol and as the ideal to which the boys aspire to become compassionate, honest, and willing to make sacrifices in the name of family and country. The title of the book invites us to think immediately beyond the literal meaning of the word heart, a physical organ, to take advantage of its richness of metaphorical meaning. Instead, Dr. Truglio proposes to focus on the literal, corporeal sense of the word, the heart as a bodily organ. Consequently, instead of moving metaphorically towards the emotional connotation of the word, he moves metonymically to think of the heart as a signifier of the human body, and specifically as a signifier of the bodies of the children in the book. In this regard, some of the elements that Dr. Truglio works on in this text are, on one hand, the interclassist harmony through the literary construction of body, and she also identifies unique bodily attributes for some characters, such as Nelly, Cressy, and Rovetti, who are alluded to as the hunchback, the redhead, or bad arm, and the crutch, respectively. In this sense, each boy functions as a stereotype. Taylor, in his essay of imagology based on stencil, points out that the stereotypes combines minimal information with maximum meaning. This minimal information load with meaning through these epithets facilitates by means of contrast the configuration of the narrator protagonist, I. This boy, Enrico, does not describe his somebody. Dr. Truglio investigates this phenomenon of absence, making a very fruitful connection with the discourses on corporality that in the 1880s were born in the field of criminal anthropology, led by Cesare Lagos. In this research, he will show that although the Amicis does not strictly follow Lombroso in correlating specific physical qualities with form of criminal behavior, he does seem to do so in the establishment of a notion of normality through the manifestation of physical deviation that are highlighted in the novel. In conjunction with biopolitics, Trujillo also seeks to investigate how these corporalities promote moral and health code. In the same way, and hand in hand with imagology, he will show how the body of the most talented and the most handsome, such as the Rosis, generates a beauty in the novel that merge narratively with the beauty of the landscape. The body in his study has fully internalized the map of a unified Italy, and his beautiful body serves as a justifying analogy of the beauty of the natural landscape, which is now politically unified into a single whole, a healthy body, which is nevertheless compassionate and caring, demonstrating the values of duty and benevolent responsibility toward those who are socioeconomically less fortunate or have physical deviation. In a second section of our paper, we present here we can see how the representation of windows, of light and air are used in the story, the separation of children in different buildings and all regulated by the state. It seemed like a benevolent strategy that, quoting Laura Dos, is an strategy, I will say benevolent, missing a proper word to describe it. Now I'm going to pass you the second section of our paper, where we present Dr. Emily Stert on Anne Davila Cardinal's novel 5 Midnights, published in 2019. This is titled Coming of Age with El Cuco, reproduction of El Cuco myth in 5 Midnights. Dr. Sturt proposes that the young adult horror novel Cinco Medianoches, Five Midnights offers a modern re-narration of the Cuckoo myth in its depiction of a group of Rican teenagers growing up. Like the boogeyman, the cuckoo is a mythical monster that Latin American parents frequently invoke to persuade their children to behave themselves. The novel tells the story of Lupe Davila, a 16 years old gringa Rican who travels from Vermont to Puerto Rico to spend the summer with her aunt and uncle. Gringa Rican means a woman which is half American and half Puerto Rican. While there, she becomes involved in a mysterious murder case in which former members of the Los Cangrejos gang are inexplicably killed one by one on the eve of their 18th birthday. Lupe begins to befriend former Cangrejo Javier, and the team work together to solve the case before Javier turns 18. Despite spending every summer on the island, Lupe feels that she doesn't know the real Puerto Rico, the one that Javier and the rest of Los Cangrejos know well. Only Marisol, Lupe's counterpart, identifies herself as an independentist and recognizes the systemic problems derived from poverty, corruption, and neoliberal policies in a country burned by foreign debt and financial vultures. Let's remember that Puerto Rico is a state under US political domination. At one point in the story, we learned that the cuckoo character was summoned by the mothers of the crabs, cangrejos, after children were caught using drugs for the first time when they were 13 years old. For the next 5 years, the boogeyman, el cuco, haunts each child. In this context, both Los Cangrejos and Marisol come of an age through a form of body mutilation when they turn to substance abuse to confront the cuco and society. Dr. Emily Sturt proposes to critically evaluate the novel's use of the figure of El Cuco to transmit a narrative about the maturing of a Puerto Rican national identity. In her analysis, Sturt looks at the link between this narrative of collective identity and the processes of youthful maturing and identity construction. According to this, in the character's maturing transformation from childhood to adolescence, there are great gender disparities in the descriptions of each boy or girl and their confrontation with El Cuco. Marisol's character is the only one mistreated by the state and considered crazy. Because of Marisol's unique characterization, Esther chooses to focus on her role in the novel. Through a transnational feminist reading of Five Midnights, Emily Sturt argues that the character of Marisol challenged neoliberal solutions to poverty by focusing on Lupe, the gringa Rican, and through her incorporation of the character of El Cuco and the violence the monster provokes. The book promotes among its young readers the incorporation of Puerto Rican as a state of the US nation, while at the same time criminalizing the independentists. As the third and last section, I present my contribution, which, like the others, has the possibility of becoming an independent work. The subtitle is Animal-Human-Animal Transformation in Written Versions of Native People Stories. As we said at the beginning, there are canonical narratives such as Heart that enhance corporeality as a mere tool of reasoning, using the concrete to symbolize and exploit meanings associated with desire, desirable values for young people, silencing the more material dimensions of corporeal. This separation between body and mind, characteristic of a modern vision, is beginning to be questioned to the point that we are currently witnessing a return to pre-modern conceptions in the sense of conceiving the human being as part of nature, a response to the anthropocentrism that characterized the myth of progress. We observe that the vision is manifested in part of Latin America's children's literature, evidence in the interest of writers to produce and publish works that bring the stories and culture of the native people of America closer to the new generations. In this case, Chile, as Isabel Ibaceta states, has a phenomenon that is a part of a process of generation of identitary meanings that move away from those raised by the dictatorship. Especially we focus on the literary motif of human-animal and animal-human transformation and its possible meanings in relation to cultural, national, and planetary identities in written versions of mythical and legendary tales of native people of Chile. For this purpose, we selected two anthologies, Adventures and Origins of Birds, and Adventures and Greatness of Chilean Animals by Sonia Montesino and Catalina Infante, and illustrated by Alejandra Acosta, which bring together a set of stories from different native people of the Chilean territory. In them, we identify different transformations in which animals become humans, humans become animals, or have the quality of mutating from one species to another. It should be noted that the motif of the human-animal-human transformation is also found in popular marvelous stories, also known as fairy tales. In the stories from Montesino and Infante's anthologies, what motivates the transformation is usually love and liberation, but also salvation, punishment, or overcoming a prohibition. Transformation occurs in some stories because it is a quality of the animal or human. In other cases, by means of a magical action, such as a spell. Some of the stories are the following: the Rapa Nui legend of the black crab who protects her grandson from the Aku Aku spirit, and out of love recovers her human form. The Setnang myth of the young girl who transforms into a sea lion out of love for a wolf. The story of Patas de Guanaco, who intercedes and maintains the balance between human and guanacos. The Mapuche tale of the young man who was raised by animals and who can overcome trials and integrate into the human world with animal wisdom. And the Aymara legend, in which a young man gives up his desire to marry because his suitors are unable to recognize his dual nature. In all the stories of transformation, we find a close relationship between humans and animals, and between both with nature. This symbiosis strengthens the idea of the relationship between all living things in whose chain the human being is a link. We suggest that the story's version by the authors do not point to a scientific anthropological intention, but make the stories their own, in the sense of adding their voices to others, to the previous ones, recognizing the cultural identity of the communities of origin. The Aymaras say, the Mapuche tale, likewise, they mark the living presence of most of these people and their stories by using the verb of diction. They say, they tell. Finally, by gathering stories by using the verb of diction. And finally, by gathering stories from different geographic areas of Chile and from different native people. Doing so, they reaffirm the ethnocultural and identity heterogeneity of Chile as a nation. That's my presentation. Thank you.
Tu capacidad de poner todo el trabajo junto, tu
Thank
síntesis.
you, Jimena, for your summary.
Muchas gracias, Jimena, de nuevo por todo tu
Thank you again
por poner
for your work
en diálogo ahí los
and for your dialogue
em,
and all the updates.
ahora
Now
vamos a presentarles a
we are going to present Dr. María Truglio,
quien tiene a cargo
who is in charge of
magistral.
the keynote speech.
Vamos a escuchar su ponencia que se
We are going to listen to her presentation titled Intertextuality in Italian Children's Book on Immigration, the Andes, the Apennines, and the Atlas Mountains. Dr. Maria Truglio is professor of Italian and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Penn State. She earned her BA from Wesleyan University and PhD from Yale University. Dr. Truglio's research focuses on Italian literature and culture from the 19th century to the present, children's literature, and critical methodologies, especially psychoanalysis, semiotics, post-structuralism, and feminist approaches. Her books include Beyond the Family Romance, The Legend of Pascoli, published by the University of Toronto Press in 2007. Italian Children's Literature and National Identity, Childhood, Melancholy, Modernity, published by Routledge in 2017, and she's also the co-editor of Modernism and the Avant-Garde Body in Spain and Italy, also published by Routledge in 2016. Her current project examines how contemporary books from children in Italy represent migration. Has received support from the Children's Literature Association and Penn State Center for Global Studies. She has published articles on this topic in Romantic Review magazine, Children's Literature Association Quarterly, and for Coming, the Lion and the Unicorn. Dr. Truglio is participating in an oral history project funded by Penn State CHI, entitled Center County's History Otherwise, narrating and mapping Brazilian, Hispanic, and Italian women's stories, led by Dr. Judith Sierra Rivera. He also serves on the International Committee of the Children's Literature Association. In 2020 and 2022, she served as faculty coordinator for Penn State's Redesigning Modernities project, produced Levy and open educational resource. Dr. Truglio teaches also a range of courses that include Romanticism in Italy, women writers, Italian-American culture, Italian theaters, advanced language development, and artistic patronage in Europe. I let you with Dr. Truglio.
I needed to unmute before I share my screen. Thank you so much, Isabel. I want to start, of course, by echoing Emily's thanks to Isabel Ibaceta for her incredible leadership of this project over the past many months. I also want to quickly thank my department, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese at Penn State, as well as the Children's Literature Association that have supported parts of this research. My talk today comes in part from a piece that was recently published in Romantic Review. If anybody would like a copy of that, you can email me. My email is on the first slide there, mxt34@psu.edu. Finally, because we are already working in two languages, my quotations from the Italian originals, I'll read in my own English translation, but some of the Italian will be on the screen. So, and finally, thank you all for attending this afternoon. So Dr. Ibaceta has led our group over the past year as we have looked at the ways in which children's literature can construct, foster, and reimagine the national identities of its readers. Many beloved children's tales have become sites of deep national attachments. Isabel recently shared with me a quotation from Chilean writer Alberto Fuguet. In 2007, he declared, "Anyone who does not know who Papalucho is either has not been a child, does not have children, or is simply not Chilean." I was struck by the rhetorical parallels between this quip and a famous remark by Italian journalist Giuseppe Prezzolini. In 1923, Prezzolini declared, "Whoever understands the beauty of Pinocchio understands Italy." These pithy remarks celebrate two fun-loving boy characters from beloved books. They claim a certain power for children's literature, but they do not explain the mechanisms at work. As the title of my talk suggests, two ways in which children's books can cultivate national identity are through representation of geography, as in the three mountain ranges I name, or through evocation of a literary heritage, intertextuality, which will be my focus today. Italy is one of the nations that our group has been considering. In a previous study, I examined a corpus of children's books from the decades following Italy's 1870 political unification. I argued that these books engendered a sense of national identity in the context of a very culturally diverse population. Through depictions of Italy's beautiful landscape, through narratives of Giuseppe Garibaldi's military heroism, and through a particular modeling of gender roles, children's books from 1870 to 1920 made Italians out of the many different local cultures up and down the peninsula. And I'll just note that the image I chose for the front cover of my study comes from Edmondo de Amicis's novel Heart that Jimena was just discussing. In more recent years, as immigration has taken center stage in Italy's political landscape, demographic changes have prompted a need to reimagine the nation. My talk today will look at how children's books in Italy, published since the 1990s, have portrayed the phenomenon of immigration. I focus on one book which employs intertextuality as an example. As evident in every political campaign in Italy in the past 3 decades at least, immigration is a hotly debated and divisive topic. My slide here shows some extreme anti-immigrant rhetoric from the past decades. The discussion of how Italy should respond to its demographic changes has not remained exclusive to the adult world. As just 2 examples, in 2003, a Muslim rights activist won a court case requiring that crucifixes be removed from his children's primary public school classrooms, eliciting national debates. In fall of 2018, the mayor of a town in Lombardy, a member of the right-wing Lega party, which is some of the propaganda you see here on the screen, this mayor introduced a policy that compelled many immigrant children to eat their home-packed lunches segregated from their peers, causing a national outcry as well as a right-wing counter-response. Put bluntly, the arrival of refugees, displaced persons, and other immigrants from African and Middle Eastern countries has prompted some in Italy to feel that their cultural heritage, from cuisine to religion to language, is under threat. Political discourse and media representations often frame the arrival of migrants, both voluntary and forced, as a crisis or an emergency. Hotly contested debates about appropriate national and international interventions unfold within that paradigm of emergency. Within this context, picture books, chapter books, and young adult novels portray the experiences of refugees and immigrants for young readers. They offer potential alternatives to the images that children receive from other forms of media. Not surprisingly, requests from schools and parents for books about current events have encouraged the publication of many texts written to respond quickly to market demand. Della Passarelli, the editorial director of the publishing house Sinos, has noted that the topic of immigration has been in extremely high demand, and she laments the production of weak books that are full of stereotypes. Alongside the high demand for timely books on this topic lies the evident concern among adults that depictions of the plight of immigrants may be potentially traumatizing or confusing for young readers. As one example, in an essay written for the journal Christian Family, a father shares his experience trying to explain to his son the disturbing images they see on TV. The piece is framed by concerns over the traumatizing effects of these images. On the screen, I have the Italian, and in English, the quotation reads, quote, "What ideas are children getting about this world of ours that fills the depths of the Mediterranean with cadavers? A father tries to explain things to his son so that the nightmarish images of shipwrecks seen on TV won't assail him in the middle of the night," end quote. A powerful illustration by Francesco Chiacchio movingly conveys this kind of concern. Chiacchio's black and white image is from Maria Attanasio's 2008 novel, From the Atlas Mountains to the Apennines. Here we see the young protagonist, Yosef, watching television. Yosef has fled Morocco to search for his mother in Italy. At this moment, the moment of the illustration, he is hiding out from Italian authorities in the barracks of undocumented agricultural laborers in Sicily. While the older immigrants work in the fields, Yosef learns from the TV news that a boat, which had set out from Libya on the same day as his own, had subsequently shipwrecked. He discovers that most of those passengers were, quote, "lost namelessly among the waves and sharks," end quote. Instead of feeling lucky to have narrowly escaped such a death, Yosef feels, quote, "more radically orphaned than ever, abandoned like a stone in a well in an unknown place they call Sicily," end quote. In Chiacchio's illustration, the sea waters and the doomed vessel break through the television screen and come flooding into the room where Yosef sits. As the water reaches the boy's feet, the breached screen suggests the kind of psychological rupture this kind of loss can engender. While news of the shipwreck crashes in on him, Yosef shields his face protectively, as if trying, belatedly, to blind himself to what he has just seen. The image, I suggest, literalizes the fear of flooding and overwhelming the child viewer or reader with representations of trauma, representations that this very book includes. In other words, the ruptured TV screen speaks in a metatextual way about the process of mediation itself, with its risks and limitations. We, as readers, do not merely see the shipwreck. We see a child seeing the shipwreck through a screen. Yosef's posture suggests the possible damaging effects on that child. Kyakkyo's image opens another metatextual question. Who is the child whom we adults fear to traumatize with representations of atrocities like drowned bodies and shipwrecks? The fact that Yosef discovers the doomed ship's fate from a television report aligns him with other children who learn about such tragedies from the news media rather than from direct experience. However, he himself is an immigrant who has experienced the dangerous sea crossing and many other horrors directly. The artist marks this difference in the sparseness of the barracks, the small, old-fashioned vacuum tube TV with its antennae is perched on a simple wooden chair, and the only other furnishing in the room is the table on which Yosef sits. This scene, so that one there, right, contrasts with the more comfortable homes in which many of this book's readers are likely to live, read, and watch TV on more modern devices. As a point of contrast, we see here an image from a 1968 Italian picture book showing another child watching TV. This image is more typical of the kinds of homes Italian children have seen in books published since the post-war economic boom, post-World War II economic boom in Italy. And this image is just one from a corpus of about 35 books that Italian scholar Marni Campagnaro has analyzed in its representations of well-lit and well-equipped homes in Italian picture books since World War II. Throughout Adenasio's book, as I will discuss, Yosef maintains this doubleness of similarity and difference vis-a-vis potential readers who are not themselves immigrants. This doubleness, which both facilitates and limits the reader's identification with Yosef, serves, I think, as part of the novel's ethical agenda. The image, in short, encodes a number of questions and concerns about the nature of the books that are currently in high demand. How should they screen their troubling content? To whom should they be addressed? And what will their effect be? The goals of eliciting empathy in children and explaining to them complex historical and contemporary events can be challenged by the perceived need to shield some children from traumatizing scenes. We can usefully frame this specific dynamic within the more general pedagogical question of the relationship between utile and dulce, useful and sweet. As scholar Terry Fronja has demonstrated, negotiating the dual and at times competing aims to instruct, utile, useful, and to delight, dulce, sweet, this negotiation informs the Italian tradition of theorizing children's literature. Examining the growing corpus of books that responds to the market demand for educational narratives about immigration in Italy, appropriate for young readers, I have found that recourse to canonical stories, such as Pinocchio and Heart, has emerged as a strategy of screening and to some extent sweetening those bitter narratives. So that this intertextuality, to me, seems to be a strategy to negotiate these competing demands. In addition to Maria Atanasio's book that I would focus on today, some other titles that employ intertextuality are here on your screen. The English would be The Story of Ishmael Who Crossed the Sea, Antigone is Sitting in the Last Row, Karim, From the Other Side of the Sea, Mediterranean, Above the Water and Under the Sea, Under the Sky, and The Sea Hides the Stars, right, among others. These books allude to canonical texts such as Pinocchio, Moby Dick, the adventure novels of Emilio Salgari, and Alessandro Manzoni's The Betrothed, among others, in their narration of migration stories. Dominique Sandis, a scholar of Greek children's literature, has included intertextuality as a specific way in which children's literature constructs auto and hetero national images. And in the previous presentations, we've been mentioning the work of this scholar who is among those who use imagology to think about national identity in children's literature. I use this term here, that is intertextuality, in a restricted way to designate moments in which authors and illustrators overtly link their own narratives or images, their own narratives to images of the classics of the Western canon. Drawing on Dominique Sandis's account, then, I am looking at instances of intentional intertextuality deployed through quotation and imitation in reference to specific earlier texts. Authors then accentuate their links with other texts. In this sense, intertextuality foregrounds the issue of representation itself by referencing stories that are likely to be familiar to their target readers. Writers and illustrators provide an inroad for those readers to the new narratives they tell. The strategy can, quote, mobilize bundles of knowledge, end quote. That is also from Sandis. These textual echoes call attention to their own mediating function, that is, overt references to other books avows rather than denies or suppresses the fact that these books are representations. At the same time, harnessing classics of the Western canon as a screen through which to understand the lives of those coming from the global South can risk domesticating their stories by assimilating them to European models. I suggest that we might productively consider canonical hypotexts, that is, like the source texts, as a kind of familiarizing sweetener or mediating screen through which readers can discern and digest painful stories. In so doing, however, we must ask what is screened out in the process, or rendered invisible through the superimposition of these potentially domesticating mediators. Similarly, we must remain attuned to how these very metaphors might ontologize the processes these narratives aim to represent. That is, thinking about a canonical hypotext such as Pinocchio or Heart as a sugar coating or a screen that both protectively conceals and palatably delivers certain harsh realities, can encourage an understanding of those realities as stable objects. Such metaphors can therefore obscure the complex historical processes and sets of relations which generate moments that then become fossilized and spectacularized through images like a capsized ship. Through the example explored here, I probe the potentials and the limits of this kind of intertextuality. In her 2008 From the Atlas Mountains to the Apennines, Maria Attanasio frames her entire narrative along the model of the hypotext. Attanasio explained in an interview that she first conceived of the idea for this book when a colleague suggested that she reread the book Heart by Edmondo de Amicis. Heart, and we've already heard about Heart from Jimena, published about the same time as Pinocchio, remained for decades the canonical children's book in Italy. This secular nation-building novel for children includes within it several inspirational short stories. The most famous of these short stories is the beloved tale From the Apennines to the Andes. and it was a thrill for me to see the Andes for the first time last month. In this sentimental tale, 13-year-old Marco courageously leaves his home in Genoa in northern Italy and travels to Argentina in search of his mother. Like many other Italians of that period, Marco's mother had emigrated to Argentina to find work, but after 2 years, she had lost touch with her family. The tale celebrates the young boy's courage in the face of many obstacles and his persistence as he treks across the ocean and then for miles inland on his long quest. The story, furthermore, reflects the painful reality of Italy's own post-unification wave of emigration into the Americas, as Marco encounters scores of other Italian immigrants on each step of his journey. When Atanasio reread that 19th century tale, she was struck by the parallels with contemporary migration, and she was moved to use that tale as the backbone for a new narrative that would invert the direction of the child's journey. Rather than a boy leaving Italy to go to the Americas, a boy is trying to get to Italy from Morocco to search for his mother. Atanasio makes this mirroring strategy overt through the title, which repositions the Apennines as the arrival rather than the departure point, and through structuring the plot almost step by step on the model of De Amicis's narrative. Atanasio also includes direct references to the source tale, such as when a scene unfolds on De Amicis Street, or when Joseph, while working in southern Italy, adopts the Italian name Marco for himself. These overt references keep the source text ever present and invite readers to reflect on the overlay of the two narratives. Joseph, like Marco, must endure cold, hunger, loneliness, and fear, as well as abuse and exploitation by employers, as he seeks his mother with increasing desperation. The constant presence of De Amicis makes it difficult to forget that not long ago, millions of Italians, scholars estimate up to 13 million, emigrated to flee poverty, exploitation, and political disruption in their homeland, and faced similar kinds of obstacles and dangers that those coming into Italy now confront. This fusion of Marco and Joseph clearly invites a deep empathic response. The pervasive presence of the hypotext, again, the hypotext being heart, however, risks a collapse of past into present, an erasure of cultural and historical difference, and a reduction of the other to the self. Atanasio, I think, addresses this risk overtly in describing Joseph's own growing self-alienation while in Italy. He feels himself becoming more and more Marcuccio the longer he is in Italy. And I don't know if they do this in Spanish. In Italy, they will often add a suffix to the end of a word, including a name. So Marcuccio is little or sweet Marco, right? And a quotation from the novel reads, quote, "In the evenings, lying on his cot, Marcuccio calls himself, 'Joseph, Joseph.' But as the weeks go by, Joseph answers back less and less, the more he is immersed in that new language, which he already speaks after just a few months." So I think this is one example in which the narrative navigates this risk of domestication, and it does so in several other ways. Atanasio departs from De Amicis, who is known for his heavy-handed sentimentality, very heavy-handed sentimentality, in the conclusion of the tale, where Marco, for De Amicis, reunites with his mother, right? There's a happy ending with the reunion scene. Joseph, instead, is on his way toward his mother, but the ending remains more ambiguous, right? It's not a clear-cut conclusion. thus denying the readers the consolation of a satisfyingly tied-up happy ending. Atanasio remarked that she wanted to leave the conclusion open, in part, quote, because I personally don't like stuff that is too saccharine, end quote. The adjective in her remark, in Italian stolcinato, recalls the dulce et utile, dulce, right, sweet and useful maxim of pedagogy, and attests to Atanasio's general narrative approach, which retains the bitterness of the stories that she tells. Indeed, the novel recounts many moments that would certainly be considered traumatic or symptoms of traumatic memory. The inclusion of these details resists the collapse of difference with the hypotext, maintaining the differences between Joseph and Marco. Joseph witnesses the death of his closest friend, Fuad, who is trampled by the crowd of emigrants rushing to board their boat. He develops the habit of burning himself with a cigarette out of a sense of guilt. He lives with laborers who work such long hours in the merciless heat of a Sicilian greenhouse that one of them collapses and dies. He himself nearly freezes to death while being smuggled in the back of a food truck. While the structure of this book relies on the intertextual relationship with De Amicis's canonical tale, this content instead comes from direct interactions Atanasio has had with young immigrants from Africa in her hometown of Caltagirone, a hill town in central Sicily. In 2007, Atanasio spoke with a group of a dozen young people living in a camp for immigrants, and the stories they told her became the source of the events in the novel. Joseph, she explained to me, is a composite of the dozen young people in that Caltagirone camp, and the trials he faces are a compilation of the stories those children told her. His plural identity, as she put it, engenders a character that, quote, may seem fictional, but the stories are real, end quote. She plots these boys' real stories within De Amicis's fictional frame. Atanasio, I think, thus activates associations with the past while maintaining the uniqueness of the present and the specific wounds that it inflicts. The potential conflation of present and past is also resisted linguistically. As Marco travels from Buenos Aires to Rosario, Cordova, and Tucumán, he finds emotional comfort and tangible support from fellow emigrants who speak Italian, and even at times his local dialect from Genova, in the De Amicis story. Atanasio also addresses the question of language in Josef's experiences, but does so in a different way. Having spent much time in North Africa herself, Atanasio embeds a lexicon of Arabic words into her Italian narrative. Hammam, dirham, souk are just a few examples. And forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the Arabic. Readers who do not know Arabic must glean the meaning of these words from context. For example, as Joseph arrives in a new Italian city and gets off the bus in a piazza, he sees that, quote, young men and women are hanging around in groups, selling incense, playing flutes and darbuka, or just walking around, end quote. The context of the sentence and the accompanying image suggest the significance of darbuka, but do not clearly define it, allowing the non-Arabic speaking reader to feel at least a modicum of the disorientation that Joseph experiences in Italy. We can contrast this strategy to the approach adopted by several other books that thematize migration stories, where non-Italian words from the protagonist's native language are sometimes explained in a footnote, or more often defined in a glossary at the back of the book, or via a similar peritextual apparatus. Atanasio's approach instead makes more cognitive demands on the reader and reminds readers that Joseph is not De Amicis's Marco, resisting the reader's complete identification with Joseph and thus disrupting any seamless immersion into the story as if it were an adventure novel. One last point of similarity with a difference. Where Marco travels inland from Buenos Aires to Rosario on a vessel loaded with fruit, Joseph is smuggled in a fruit truck as he heads north from Ragusa in Sicily up towards Bologna. The contrast with the hypotext highlights key differences, however. In this case, De Amicis's Marco certainly suffers discomfort during the 3-day journey up the Paraná River, but does not come as close to dying as Joseph does. More importantly, in De Amicis's tale, the origins and the destinations of the fruit alongside which Marco travels remain unknown to the reader and unimportant to the story. On the contrary, Joseph himself has worked with other clandestine laborers in the fields and greenhouses that grow the fruit being transported north. He has seen a co-worker die from exhaustion. He knows the standard pay of 10 euros per day, and he has been warned that the supervisor will often skim even from that tiny sum. He has befriended Orazio, the driver who regularly transports the produce all the way up to Venice, illustrating the routes by which the literal fruits of immigrants' labor are distributed throughout the peninsula. Despite the threats against trying to escape, Joseph makes his plan with Orazio to get to Bologna. Thus, much more thoroughly than Marco's story in the De Amicis tale, Joseph's tale is overtly inscribed within the broad economic processes that underlie these migrations. In a manner that is accessible to the age of its target readers, the text's engagement with De Amicis allows it to, quote, lay bare the production of subalternity that contemporary capitalism imposes, and to illuminate, quote, transnational labor mobility, as do books for adults authored or co-authored by immigrants in Italy. And here I'm drawing on Bouchard and Fermi. The overlay between Joseph and Marco is deeply effective in eliciting the kind of empathy that might resist dehumanizing media images. Beyond this gesture, the story not only registers specific differences between Joseph and potential readers, it also dramatizes the processes that constitute those differences. That is, it points to economic systems by which the comforts of the well-lit and well-equipped homes more commonly seen in Italian children's books not only differ from, but are in fact predicated upon the conditions in which Joseph lives and works. The combination of the 19th century form and the 21st century content becomes a powerful way of highlighting the parallels with Italy's own emigrant past, thus facilitating an empathic connection. Beyond this connection, through screening the historical specificity of Joseph's tale, the intertextuality prompts a reevaluation of the present. I'll conclude by returning to the witticisms with which I began, noting that in the Italian corpus I'm looking at, Pinocchio often functions as a hypotext. While those charming claims about the canonical status of Papeluccio and Pinocchio attest to the enduring appeal of these classics, we should note too how both claims leverage a logic of exclusion. Those who have not read Papeluccio are not Chilean. Those who do not appreciate Pinocchio's beauty do not understand Italy. The growing corpus of texts, some of which I noted today, offer, I think, some hope that more recent production for children can begin to offer more inclusive visions of belonging and community for young readers. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Gracias, María, muchísimas gracias
Thank you, Maria,
por tu presentación, por
for your
compartir
presentation,
tus indagaciones.
for sharing your
Me,
investigation.
me parece sumamente relevante
I think it's
en,
highly important
en el contexto global en que vivimos,
in the global context that we're living in,
en el cual, debido a fenómenos
in which,
diversos,
due to
económicos,
different phenomena
políticos,
like economic,
culturales,
cultural,
vivimos desde hace varios siglos, ¿cierto? Y
they've been around for many
especialmente
centuries,
en las últimas
especially
décadas,
in the last decades,
con fenómenos migratorios muy
with
importantes que
migration
de alguna
phenomena that are
manera
very important,
van cambiando
which in
las
some way they
configuraciones
change
y las dinámicas
the configuration and the dynamics
relacionales de la población, ¿cierto? Nos constituimos
in
en
relationships with the
poblaciones
nation.
eh,
We're
diversas.
constituted by diverse population.
Pienso que lo que relata respecto de los
think
fenómenos
when you
históricos
talk about the historical
que han
phenomena
vivido en Italia, ¿cierto?
that Italy has been going
Que
through,
vivieron, ¿cierto?
that they
De
lived at some
inmigración,
point, regarding immigration,
cómo podemos verlo también en tantas otras latitudes y
is how we can
particularmente en el
see
caso
them in
nuestro, ¿cierto?
other examples, even in
Se hace
our case.
evidente en que tenemos en las últimas
It
décadas,
is evident that during the last
últimas
decade,
5 o 6 décadas,
around 5 or 6 decades,
grandes movimientos migratorios
we have
desde
very
distintos países
important
de Latinoamérica,
migrational
¿ya?
movements in Latin American countries.
Así que me parece que es una línea de investigación
I think it's
muy necesaria,
a necessary line of
muy
research
que tiene una contribución un impacto muy grande en el
also
ámbito de la educación y de las
impacts
humanidades,
education and
porque tal como tú
human
señalabas,
science.
y ese es un fenómeno que tal vez
And as you
quisieras
said,
comentar un poquito más, no sé, a menos
maybe you would
que
like to share about
tengamos
the
alguna
phenomena you
pregunta.
mentioned. If we have any question, maybe.
Pero si no tenemos todavía, señor director, alguna
If we
pregunta,
don't have any questions yet,
tal vez quisieras comentar un poco más
maybe you would like to share
de este fenómeno en el
about
cual
the phenomena,
los libros sobre migración
the
son
books
producidos
on migration
como
are
una oferta y
produced
demanda, ¿cierto? En
as
esta
a
relación comercial y
as a
económica
commercial
que a veces es muy lucrativa.
situation.
En Chile, por ejemplo, uno de los
For example,
grandes,
in Chile,
uno de los grandes financiadores del
one of
área
the biggest
de las
funders
de las editoriales infantiles
of children's editorials
es el gobierno,
is the
porque a
government,
través de los sistemas educacionales
because
se
through the
genera la
educational
demanda
systems,
sobre
the
ciertas
demand
temáticas
is generated on certain topics,
políticamente, cierto, necesarias en la actualidad.
politically necessary in
Entonces,
actuality.
entonces em, se genera una gran producción y un gran mercado
Therefore,
en
there
torno
are
a esta
a lot
demanda.
of productions and market regarding this demand.
Imagino que a eso te referías un poco, a un
I
fenómeno similar,
imagine
tal vez.
that you
No sé si
mention
Si
a
quieres
similar phenomenon.
agregar algún.
I don't know if you would like to add something.
Sure. Thank you, Isabel. And yeah, it's very interesting to see, how globally these parallel movements are developing. So in regards to these publications, I mentioned toward the beginning of my talk, I had the chance to speak about 3 or 4 years ago with the editor, one of the editorial directors of Sinos, Sinnos, which is a publishing house based in Rome. And they have been very active in publishing, for example, bilingual books in many languages, as well as other, I think, pretty high quality publications, not just about migration, but actually for immigrant children and the children of immigrants. And she, in that conversation we had, pointed out how this market demand does seem to have generated sort of this speedy production of books that can also often be full of stereotypes. I've noticed in some texts, for example, you'll get a story where there's no conversation at all about the protagonist's life before the day they are on a capsized ship, right? The story starts with that media fetish of the capsized ship, and there's just no discussion of any life that protagonist might have experienced prior to that moment. Others, however, I think, do some really interesting cultural work in the way they explore these different themes. I would say Sinos, as well as a press called Orecchio Acerbo, which is another sort of niche, high-quality press based in Rome, have put out really interesting books. And now this production is being picked up by the major houses like Garzanti and Einaudi. The books for children seem to be following behind a little bit the books for adults on this topic, but it's already a pretty large field. I don't know, Isabel, what the role of the Italian government is in funding or fostering any of this. Is a really interesting question. Right now, Italy is under a center-right government. But it would be interesting to find out if there is actually government support for these kinds of publications. So yeah, thanks for that question.
You're welcome, Maria, and thank you for your answer. No sé si Emily y Jimena también quieren.
No sé
Emily
si
está levantando la mano por ahí.
o Ximena quieren intervenir. Emily levanta la mano.
It's related to Isabel's previous question. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the reception of Atanasio's book and if it itself has reached an international audience or has been translated, for instance. Yes, okay, so there is a translation. And so another thing, or
this is the Italian, actually.
Oh, okay. So I guess that's part one. Part two would be that throughout this project, we've talked a lot about how De Amici has reached the Americas and elsewhere, obviously. So I'm wondering if Atancio herself has reached the Americas or perhaps North Africa in particular.
Thank you, Emily. So with this book, it was first published in 2008. It was widely reviewed and in a very positive way in a full range of journals and outlets and magazines. All the reviewers immediately underscored the connection with De Amicis. I mean, it just screams that intertextuality. So very positively reviewed. It was actually then republished in 2015. I suspect that might have been because that was a peak year of migration in Italy. When I've been in Italy, it's not a book that you just find in the bookstores in Italy. If you go to the children's section or the young adult section, it's no longer easily on the shelf. So you have to hunt it down a little bit if you want to buy a copy of it. I'm not sure what the sales of it were. So it was critically very well received and reprinted. But I don't think it was a bestseller. I don't think it's ever been translated into any other languages. So thank you. I also want to check into that. Maria Attanasio is a very well-known writer, a Sicilian woman writer. And this is her only children's book. She primarily writes historical novels for adults, as well as she has a corpus of poetry. And she likes to write about women from the past about whom she finds some trace in the archive and then sort of invents a full-fledged narrative around them. And the most recent one is, and this was to me just really fascinating, when Garibaldi liberated southern Italy from the Bourbon monarchy, he had famously with him the red shirts, the 1,000 red shirts. Apparently there were like 1,010 men and one woman in that group. And so her last novel was about that one woman with the red shirts. But so in terms of the circulation of this book by Attanasio, in spite of the fact that she's a prize-winning author, does lots of media interviews, well-known writer in Italy, I don't think this book has gotten a lot of global attention. And I wish it would. And I was really saddened by the relevance, particularly of Yosef's story as a boy coming from Morocco, given just what happened this week in the waters between Morocco and the Canary Islands. So I think her book, unfortunately, remains really relevant. Yeah, so Emily, I forget now, was there other parts of your question?
No, thank you so much. I think if I could just ask one quick follow-up.
Sure.
I'm wondering your own assessment. Do you think the author does a good job of making Italians, to use your own language there?
Nice. Right, and sort of envisioning a new Italy. I think, there are maybe places in the book, like I wish she would have spent a little more time talking about his life in Morocco. She does at least spend a couple of chapters at the beginning talking about his family and his life in Morocco. But I think otherwise, I think it's a really effective way to, again, there's a great deal of historical amnesia in Italy and in the United States about our own pasts. And I think she tries to activate that submerged past to create a link with this present scenario, and tries to envision an Italy that can, include children and people in a much more capacious way than certainly the political right wants to imagine. So thanks, Emily. That's the big question, I think. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Y thank you, María. Tenemos unas preguntas por aquí.
We have some questions
some
here.
comments. Dice, it was a really thought-provoking presentation, María. Great to see you again, albeit virtually. And as I always, I'm fascinated by the insightfulness of your academic research. We'll be in touch. We are going to ask our producer who was the person who posted that. But we have also Gustavo Velázquez Lescano, que dice, doctora Truglio, thank you for your lecture. I would like to know what the reception of Athanasios' novel has been in Italy and how the author explores the identity of Yusef as a Moroccan immigrant.
Hi, Gustavo. Thank you for being here, and thank you
Hello.
for that question. I think maybe my answer to Emily's question also applies to yours.
Yeah.
Very briefly, it certainly was a critical success and enough of a market success to be reprinted in 2015. I think, I quoted earlier in the book that, to me, very heartbreaking moment where he's calling to Yosef, and Yosef answers less and less as he feels that he's sort of losing part of his identity. And in the penultimate chapter of the book, there's the sentence that Marcuccio and Yosef have made peace with each other. So I think there is a sense in which Atanasio is striving to imagine for this protagonist a subjectivity that can maintain those roots. He continues to speak Arabic with friends and family members in Italy who speak Arabic, but also is more and more able to navigate life in Italy, and to find acceptance in Italy. So it's, as Adanasio says, she tries to avoid things that are too saccharine and too sugary, but it's certainly, I think, a hopeful and aspirational ending. So I hope that addresses the question, Gustavo. Thank you.
Gracias, Gustavo. Y gracias, María, también
Thank you, Gustavo, and
por tus
thank you,
respuestas.
Maria, for your answers.
No sé si Jimena
I don't
tenía
know if
algún
Jimena
comentario.
has any
No
commentary.
no quiero tomarme todo el tiempo preguntando cosas.
I don't want
preguntando a
to be
María.
myself who's asking all the questions.
Yeah.
Estaba pensando en todas las relaciones que se
I was
pueden
thinking
hacer
about the
entre nuestros trabajos,
the
lo que hemos
parallels that
trabajado,
can be done
cómo de
through our
alguna
work,
manera todas se van conectando
because all of them are interconnected.
entre ellas. A propósito de tu pregunta, Isabel,
Regarding your question, Isabel,
en los procesos de
I was thinking about the migration processes we are currently having,
pero también en otros fenómenos, ¿no?
but also in other phenomena,
como este reavivamiento,
this
y tal vez se relaciona un poco con
reimagining related to this migration phenomena.
de estas ideologías, ¿no? muy extremas.
These vivid
Racismos,
ideologies, extreme ideologies like fascism,
y que se manifiesta en distintas formas de
is manifested in ways of discrimination, and that is linked to our jobs, our works, linked to the identities. All of these differences, this uniqueness of culture, of ethnia, these origins, you can see them manifested in literature. And they also connect with reality, with what we are, and to what they appeal to us as a person, as a citizens of a society and of the world. As I said in my conclusion, the planetary identity is an identity way that's emerging, that's recently emerging, and goes beyond the cultural barrier. Because something is happening. In first instance, what we're doing to the planet appeals to the national frontiers, and we can see the tension between the national, very rooted, and on the other hand, we have these lines that go beyond the barrier. And we see that in one way or another in the literature. And well, literature positions itself in front of this phenomenon. Well, this is more a commentary, a reflection, rather than a question. And I also remembered some other works, a Chilean writer. I don't know if you know her. She's called María José Ferrada. She has a book on child migration from Europe to Mexico called Mexique. And that's a book it's requested by the government, by the Mexican government. They told her to write this book about this topic on children that arrive on this boat to Mexico.
Thank you so much, Jimena. Yeah, I mean, I think core to our whole project is just, rethinking the continued operability of national identities, right, in this new sort of planetary moment that we're in. And thank you also for the specific reference.
Gracias, Jimena, por los comentarios, por ahondar en esas ideas.
Thank you, Jimena, for going deep into these topics.
Un último comentario más cortito ya, porque estamos running out of time.
Because we're running out of time.
Solo que me parece súper valorable conocer toda esta producción italiana que subvierte o se sale de la mainstream, ¿cierto? De estos libros llenos de estereotipos y que están hechos rápidamente para llenar una necesidad y que no hay una mayor reflexión detrás, ¿cierto? O no hay un mayor proyecto ideológico o político más integral, digamos. Es bien interesante cómo tú, María, fuiste dando cuenta de principalmente de estas herramientas intertextuales, ¿cierto? Y de los hipotextos. Porque me vino a la mente de nuevo una de los principios de la
one of the
de la
principles of
imagology,
imagology,
en la cual se destaca el hecho de que
which
las
the fact
construcciones
of
identitarias
the,
en la
the identity
literatura
constructions in identity
son construcciones que tienen que
are
ver con la
construction
tradición literaria.
related to
Entonces
the
hace
literary
sentido
tradition.
total
So this makes
el hecho
complete
de que
sense.
estos libros que adquieren
The fact
profundidad
that this book that
eh,
are deep
estén basados y se ayuden o
are
aunque
based
se
and
endulcen
help, even though they
con,
are
con los
saccharine
clásicos,
with other classics,
porque desde ya tienen implícito un
because
peso
they
y
have an implicit meaning,
claro, un peso implícito desde ya en temas en torno a sentidos
in
identitarios.
topics regarding identitary sentiments.
Issues, yes. Y eso me parece que son libros interesantes ahí
I think those are
de,
very interesting books.
de mirarlo y también me interesaría, bueno, adquirirlo. También me quedé
I will
muy
be very
pendiente de la
interested to
pregunta de
have
si habían
one.
traducciones,
And I didn't make the question if they have translations,
pero si no, igual podría ser tener este libro
but
mm, en italiano.
I would
Así
like to have this
que,
book in Italian.
pero bueno, que se me empiezan a venir muchas ideas, otras
Well,
cosas
I
que
have
creo
so
que
many thoughts in my mind, so
tendremos tiempo de
we'll have
comentarlas
time
luego,
to talk about that later,
continuando con nuestros trabajos por ahí.
continuing
Eh,
our
por ahora
research.
quisiera agradecerles
By now, I would like to
a
thank you,
todos y a todas y a todos les participantes de este proyecto,
to thank all of the
que
participants
por
of the
supuesto no
project.
estamos todos aquí exponiendo, pero
Of course, we're
agradecer
not all present here,
a todo el resto de los colegas y los colegas que
but I want to
participaron
thank
con
all of
nosotros
the
por su
other
tiempo,
colleagues
por
that
su
participated with us,
interés
for the time,
en
for the
este
interest
proyecto
in this project,
y especialmente también a María, a
especially
Emily y a
to
Jimena
Maria, Emily, and
por hacer esta labor de presentar los avances
for presenting our
del
development
trabajo que se ha desarrollado en el
of
marco de
the
este
work we've
proyecto.
been doing within the
Muchas
framework of the
gracias a
project.
todas, a todos también
Thank you,
las personas
everyone.
que nos escucharon
Thank you to our audience,
por los canales de YouTube. Gracias también a Gustavo
via
Velázquez
YouTube,
Lascano
and thank you to
y cierto
Gustavo
las personas que nos hicieron consultas por ahí.
and the people that had questions.
Así que agradecerles a todos, a todas.
So, again, thank you, everyone.
Y como último, si hay todavía gente que esté conectada y tiene interés en
If
estas
there's people that's
temáticas y
still
trabajan,
watching us and you're
están en
interested
algún
in this
otros
topic,
países, sería muy
and if you're
interesante
from
que se
other
puedan
countries, it would be
poner en
interesting.
contacto con nosotros,
You
con
could
nosotras.
reach out to us.
Pueden escribir a mi mail
You
que
can email me.
está en el flyer
You
del
can
evento,
find my email in the flyer for
o
this
nos
event,
pueden dejar comentarios adicionales que les
or you
surjan
can
después
leave
también.
any other comment you had and you couldn't comment
Ya,
here.
en el futuro. Así que muy agradecida y les doy las buenas noches,
Thank you.
las buenas tardes,
And
los
good
buenos
night,
días
good evening,
a
good
todas y
morning.
a todas.